Great. So hi, everyone, and welcome to, I think it's session number 20, where Amanda Golbeck is going to talk to us about women and big telescopes. My name is Cecilia Lanata Briones, and I'm the chair of the History of Statistics section of the Royal Statistical Society. And Aldea, our secretary, has organized this session on our behalf. So thank you, Aldea, for putting this together for us. And obviously, thank you so much to Amanda for wanting to talk to us on this very, very interesting topic. The way that we will run this session today is that Amanda will talk for around 45 minutes, and then we will give you 15 minutes for questions. If you can pop those in the Q&A session, that would be awesome. Let me talk to you a little bit about Amanda in case you don't know her before we let her talk. She's a statistician, social scientist, and academic leader. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and is currently professor of biostatistics and associate dean for academic affairs in the Faye W. Boozman College of Public Health at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. She's also currently professor emerita in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics at the San Diego State University. She's a fellow of the American Statistical Association, an elected member of the International Statistical Institute, a past president of the Caucus for Women in Statistics, and a former Fulbright specialist to the University of Latvia at Riga. Amanda Golbeck received a Grinnell College Alumni Award. She's known for her authored book, Equivalence, Elizabeth L. Scott at Berkeley, and for her edited books, Leadership in Women in Statistics and Leadership in Statistics and Data Science, Planning for Inclusive Excellence. Amanda Golbeck was selected in 2016 to receive the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies Elizabeth L. Scott Award. Amanda Golbeck with C. Mulgard has a forthcoming authored book called Florence Nightingale David, a passionate statistician, probabilist, historian, and leader, to be published by Springer. That was a mouthful of amazing achievements. Thank you again, Amanda, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Cecilia, for the very nice introduction and for chairing this talk. Thank you, Althea, for inviting me. Thank you, Royal Statistical Society, for sponsoring this session. And thank you, conference organizers, for all of the work that you have done to make this event happen. And thank you all for coming. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about a story. I'm going to tell you about Elizabeth L. Scott, who I think was amazing. And then I'm going to tell you about her big telescope story, which I find to be unforgettable. I'm going to start with the amazing statistician Elizabeth L. Scott, who we know as Betty Scott. I am her biographer. I wrote this book about her. It's titled Equivalence, Elizabeth L. Scott at Berkeley. It was published in 2017 by Chapman & Hall, CRC Press. I approached this work with the realization that there were a number of books about men statisticians of the 20th century: Carl Pearson, William Seeley Gossett, Jerzy Neyman, and R.A. Fisher. But there were no books, none, zero, about women statisticians of the 20th century. So now we have one. We have this one about Betty Scott. Betty was an American statistician. She was a professor of statistics at the University of California at Berkeley. The Berkeley Statistics Department was founded in 1955, and she was one of the founding faculty members. So flash back for a minute to 1968. What was Betty doing? She was conducting research in 4 different areas: astronomy, statistical methods, weather modification, and biostatistics. She was teaching categorical data analysis, and she was advising students. She was functioning as the only tenured woman faculty member in the Department of Statistics at Berkeley. She was beginning her position of chair of the statistics department, its first woman chair. Now flashback for a minute to 10 years later to 1977. That's when I was a graduate student in statistics and biostatistics at Berkeley. I remember the day I met Betty at Berkeley. I wanted to change my area of doctoral study from anthropology to biostatistics, and I was seeking Betty's permission. So we met in her office. I was young and I was figuring out who I was and what I would become. That day I was trying out red nail polish. I remember how uncomfortable I felt wearing it in front of Betty. It's not that she said anything to me about it, but it seemed to not fit her attitude. Betty was welcoming. She was scary and magnetic at the same time. I must have sensed that I was in the presence of a person who spoke truth to power. This was the last time I wore red nail polish, and it was my first day as a graduate student in statistics. Now, Betty's office was on the 4th floor of a tall building at Berkeley called Evans Hall. One of the gems that I found while researching my book was an audio recording of the official groundbreaking ceremony for Evans Hall from around 1968. The Berkeley chancellor introduced Betty and then gave Betty some remarks, and then Betty gave some remarks. And it was great to hear Betty's voice again. The chancellor said Betty had been on the planning committee for Evans Hall for almost 10 years, and she was chair of the committee for several times. He said that, and I quote, "a more vigorous defender of the proposition that buildings ought to be useful to the people who are going to use them cannot be found." Now, some of Betty's former students told me that Betty made sure there were women's restrooms on every floor. She had a vision of an increasing number of women in STEM fields. The women's restrooms were a physical manifestation of her vision. Betty had photographs of galaxies on the walls of her office. It turns out that she had both a bachelor's degree in astronomy from Berkeley and a PhD in astronomy from Berkeley. So in this picture, Betty is shown in the front row with her fellow doctoral students. And you'll note that she is the only woman in that front row, and the other women in this picture were family members of the male faculty members. Betty published many papers in leading astronomy journals. It's lucky for us that she was an astronomer turned statistician. She used her statistical skills to make evidence-based arguments to promote women in science. But Betty knew she also needed a story to motivate people to look at the numbers. So she researched and told a story about women in astronomy, which I will tell you about in the second part of my talk. Now, the surfaces of Betty's office were piled high with papers. Some of these papers were from her many research projects in astronomy, statistical methods, weather modification, and biostatistics, and later in women's studies. Other papers in her office were related to her teaching. I took categorical data analysis from her, and she was supervising student projects like my master's thesis. Betty was a thoughtful correspondent. She encouraged women who she thought were deserving. And so what I have here is a letter of encouragement that she wrote to me, which I saved all these years. In this letter, she encouraged me to publish my thesis, which I did, and she encouraged me to continue on to the doctorate, which I did. When Betty died, the Bancroft Library at the University of California at Berkeley took all of her papers, and there were a lot of them. There were 148 storage file boxes in all, those big legal boxes, or 185 linear feet of materials. I'm grateful to the Bancroft Library for granting me access to all of these materials. Betty spent her entire career at the University of California at Berkeley. She rose from being Jersey Neyman's research assistant to the position of full professor in a leading statistical department. In fact, for 22 long years, she was the only woman in a tenure ladder position in her department. And you can see in this picture, the caption sums it up: alone in statistics. Because Betty was a statistician, I would be remiss if I didn't include some of the statistics that she discovered about women on the faculty at Berkeley around 1970. The statistics were eye-opening. Only 45 tenure ladder faculty members were women. This means that less than 4% of the tenure ladder faculty members were women. Only 15 full professors were women, and this means that only 2% of full professors were women. There were only 2 women chairs at the university, one of which was Betty. The San Francisco Examiner said, and I quote, "The university is not using the talents of the women that it helps to train." In fact, Betty's first project on behalf of academic women was to co-lead the development of a seminal report on the status of women at Berkeley. The report uncovered that in the psychology department at Berkeley, none of the 41 regular faculty members were women, but 27% of the PhDs produced were women. It uncovered that in mathematics, the last time a woman was appointed to a tenure ladder position was 1953. It uncovered that overall, 15 out of 34, or 44%, of departments had not had a tenured woman faculty member in over 51 years. It also uncovered that overall, out of the 100 highest academic salaries, none went to a woman. The situation for women faculty was, in Betty's words, rather dismal. And actually, it had been getting worse. I had little idea when I met Betty for the first time that she was an immensely important figure in statistics. I had no idea that she would become an honorary fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. The RSS honorary fellows, we're told by the RSS literature, are awarded to individuals of great eminence. They are regarded as the equivalent of a Guy Medal in gold for non-statisticians, therefore a great honor infrequently bestowed. I also had no idea when I met Betty for the first time that she was serving as the first woman president of the Institute of Mathematical Statistics, and she would soon become the first woman president of the International Bernoulli Society. These days, Betty has an important award and lecture named after her that is given by the Committee of Presidents of 5 major statistical societies. The societies are the American Statistical Association, the Institute of Mathematical Statistics, the International Biometric Society's Eastern North American region, the International Biometric Society's Western North American region, and the Statistical Society of Canada. The Committee of Presidents states that, and I quote, "The award recognizes an individual who exemplifies the contributions of Elizabeth L. Scott's lifelong efforts to further the careers of women in academia." We should all be glad that Betty brought all of her enormous statistical talent to her efforts to improve the status of women. Betty had social gatherings at her house for faculty and friends, excuse me. She sometimes invited graduate students to these gatherings. And we each received a map showing the Berkeley campus with Betty's house and Jersey Neyman's house and the campus in between. Betty's house made a real impression on me because the view from her front windows was of the picture-perfect Claremont Hotel in the Oakland Hills. I figured out that Betty lived with her mother. Betty never married or lived with her significant other, who was Jersey Neyman, the renowned statistics professor. Berkeley had nepotism rules, where near relatives couldn't work in the same department. Betty and her advocacy collaborators helped to change all that. They recommended that nepotism rules be replaced with conflict of interest rules, like what we're familiar with today. Betty was a leader in promoting gender equity at Berkeley. The early efforts of Betty and her gender equity collaborators at Berkeley resulted in 14 recommendations to the campus. These were written into an academic Senate report on the status of women at Berkeley. The report, which Betty co-led and which was issued in 1970, was backed by hard data. The recommendations were meant to help women of all kinds, women who were in relationships, women who had academic ambitions, women who were mothers, women who were graduate students, and women who were researchers. The recommendations were meant to help women have equal status, including in the university academic senate and in the faculty clubs on the campus. A review of the report said it was, and I quote, "the most detailed and thoughtful study on the status of women on the Berkeley campus that was ever prepared." It had nationwide impact. It inspired many other university reports on the status of academic women. In 1970, when the report was published, there was hope. But 3 years later, in 1973, Betty and her collaborators conducted an inventory, and there was a disappointing lack of progress. Here's the scorecard. Only 2 recommendations were completed. Only 5 had resulted in some changes. 3 recommendations were only being studied, and 4 recommendations had apparently been ignored. By 1978, which was only 5 years later, Betty knew that the equal status of women in academia would not be achieved in her lifetime. And finding that letter was a very sad day for me. Now, in Betty's living room, there was a horse saddle. It was her grandfather's United States cavalry saddle. He graduated from the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point, as did one of Betty's uncles and her youngest brother. So there were 3 generations of West Point graduates in Betty's family. In addition, her father graduated from the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, and her 2 other brothers also served in the military. Many of Betty's close relatives in the military were field artillery specialists, which means they were very good at mathematics. So it's clear that Betty had mathematics and service in her blood. She was even born on an Army reservation in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and called herself an Army brat. Betty didn't have the opportunity to serve in the military per se, but she did serve her country by working with Jerzy Neyman on World War II strategic bombing studies. It was important work, and the government was grateful to her, as this certificate indicates. At one point, it was said that the Berkeley group, including Betty, was contributing most of the new statistical ideas to the war effort. The work cost Betty some prestigious opportunities in her academic life, but her attitude was, "I rather feel I should do whatever I can towards the war effort." I wanted to know more about Betty's military family. I knew that one could request U.S. military service records from the National Personnel Records Center. And I managed to get the records of Betty's uncle, the one who graduated from West Point. There were about 3 inches of records. And in small print on one of the pages toward the end of the stack, I took special note of the person who was Betty's uncle, who Betty's uncle had listed as his nearest relative. The person was his sister and Betty's aunt, Phoebe Waterman. Phoebe's address was at the Mount Wilson Observatory in Southern California. This was a bingo moment for me as a biographer because it helped me to answer a burning question: how did Betty get interested in astronomy? To me, this was a compelling question because Betty spent her faculty life as a statistician, and we all know her or knew her as a statistician. So I wondered about how she became connected with astronomy back in the beginning. Betty's uncle's record indicated to me that the whole family had a connection to the field of astronomy. I was able to learn a lot about Betty's Aunt Phoebe because she studied with some well-known women astronomers at Vassar College in New York State and Lick Observatory in Northern California. Phoebe lived at a time around 1909 when women were supposed to be human computers and not professional astronomers. Today, we think of a computer as a machine. Back then, humans were computers. Human computers like Phoebe did the tedious, routine, and uncomfortable measurement work at the observatory, and they put in long hours doing it, got paid little for it, and got little recognition for it. So in this picture, you'll see Phoebe at the left with fellow girl computers. But Phoebe wanted to do more. She wanted to do what the men were doing. So she enrolled at Berkeley to do doctoral work. Phoebe was in the first class at Berkeley that graduated women with PhDs in astronomy. But even with her PhD, which qualified her to do big picture head work, Phoebe couldn't get a position as an observer in an observatory in the United States. She had to leave the country and go to South America to work. Betty's Aunt Phoebe became an important part of Betty's story. Through Phoebe, Betty already had some knowledge as a girl of how hard things were for women in science. There's a love story here. On the boat to South America, Phoebe met a German entrepreneur named Otto Haas. She soon came back to the United States and she married him. Otto co-founded the Rahm and Haas chemical company in Philadelphia. The company was hugely successful, and now the Haas family is very philanthropic. For example, they endowed an observatory in Phoebe's name at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. And the picture that you're looking at here is the Phoebe Waterman Haas Public Observatory at the Smithsonian. I thought about the Haas family when I was working on my book about Betty, and I am grateful to them for providing funding for the book. I joined the Women's Faculty Club at Berkeley, and I stayed there when I was conducting my research at the University Archives. There are two faculty clubs at Berkeley. There's the Faculty Club, and then there's the Women's Faculty Club. The Faculty Club used to be open to men only. So the women established their own club, which they named the Women's Faculty Club. Many important faculty meetings happened at the Men's Faculty Club. There are stories of women climbing through windows so that they could attend meetings there. The situation was not only humiliating for women, but it left them with nowhere close by to eat. Staying at the Women's Faculty Club was special for me because I knew Betty had been vice president of the club. She therefore was an important part of its history, but I didn't know how important. Another burning question for my book was, how did Betty become part of the Berkeley academic women's movement? And it turns out that the Women's Faculty Club was the place where the Berkeley women began to organize. So if you're interested in academic issues about women, the Berkeley Women's Faculty Club is hallowed ground. The beginning of the Berkeley academic women's movement can be traced back to a woman named Doris Briggs. Doris worked in the University of California System Office. The year was 1968. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had recently been assassinated, and there were riots in over 100 cities across the United States. The problem was inequality between Blacks and whites. The University of California system president declared that the university should be part of the solution to the problem. And he challenged members of the Berkeley academic community to come up with creative and constructive ideas. Doris Briggs responded to the president's challenge by inviting a group of influential women faculty members, including Betty, from across the disciplines to come together at the Women's Faculty Club. Doris called the group the Women's Faculty Club Study Group. She wrote, and I quote, "In thinking about the president's message, it seemed to me that there is no more vital group to tackle this challenge than the women of the faculty. You are leaders in your chosen fields and are proven creative thinkers. You also have special qualities of compassion and human warmth, which are so much needed today." And this is a picture of Betty taken around that time. Today, if you Google Doris Briggs, the woman who assembled the group of faculty women, you'll find that she is remembered for her love of the railroads. She promoted, advocated, and lobbied for rail travel, prepared volunteers in California to provide education to passengers, and received many awards for this work, including Amtrak's Champion of the Rails Award. Doris, the train lady, rode the train every day wearing her conductor's hat. But in her obit, There is no mention of her in relationship to academic women. As is often the case with women, she is given no credit, even though she is the one who planted the seed for the academic women's movement at Berkeley. She is the one who formed the group of women who met at the Women's Faculty Club in response to the urban crisis. I don't think we should forget her. After that, oops, that went too fast. After that, Betty and others took the train from there. Always a researcher, Betty immediately found some research questions. Why are there so few women on the faculty? And why are so few working toward and obtaining their PhDs? Later, Betty asked, why are women paid less than men with equivalent experience and productivity? The year was 1968. This was the beginning of an identifiable academic women's movement at Berkeley, and it was the beginning of Betty's own 20-year-long efforts to improve the status of academic women. Now, Betty was well prepared to do this advocacy work on behalf of academic women because she had already put together a good portfolio for herself of other kinds of advocacy work. Betty took on the university. When she was just starting out in her academic career, the university required that people take a loyalty oath, and this was in reaction to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. As a new PhD, she advocated to the University of California Board of Regents to eliminate the loyalty oath. Betty took on the Institute of Mathematical Statistics. As a new fellow of the IMS, she advocated to prohibit racial segregation in their institute. Betty took on civil rights. As a young academic, she helped to raise money for the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization. Betty took on the city of Berkeley. She advocated to the city council to save the Berkeley Aquatic Park from industrial use. Betty took on the court system. She helped students who protested in the free speech movement. She advocated and pledged bail money for students who she knew and for students she didn't know to keep them out of jail. There's no doubt Betty was a faculty member who saw the university as a center for research on societal problems. As I already mentioned, Betty was appointed to the position of chair of the statistics department at Berkeley. This was around the time when she began her work on the status of academic women. She was the department's first woman chair. The faculty club wasn't just closed to women being members, it was also closed to women attending meetings there. I found correspondence in Betty's collection where the president of the faculty club wrote to her and the other chairs. He asked them to get their wives to promote an upcoming party at the club. He either forgot or else disregarded the fact that she was a woman chair. Betty read the letter and she was livid. She wrote back saying, "You should know that I'm not allowed to join the faculty club. I want to tell you that this is a disgraceful situation. I am not going to encourage anyone to join a faculty club that practices discrimination. I hope that you will take some action." And with this response, she was successful in opening the door of the faculty club to women. At their next meeting, the club's board of directors took actions to allow women into parts of the club where they had previously been prohibited. Of course, the Berkeley Report on the Status of Women was just the beginning for Betty. She used her research skills to develop a number of national reports on women. Especially, she became a foremost national expert on salary inequity in academia. Her reputation eventually led to her being invited to prepare a report for the American Association of University Professors. The organization, the AAUP, has been a staunch promoter of academic freedom since the turn of the century. Betty's report was titled the Higher Education Salary Evaluation Kit. Betty's kit is a tutorial on how to use regression analysis to flag salaries that look unequitable. It was used all around the country to help identify women and minorities who should be reviewed by their administrations for adjustments in their salaries. One of her colleagues described her equity studies as extremely painstaking in their accuracy and seminal in their effect. Betty took what at the time was a non-conventional and controversial research topic, namely the status of women in academia, and she made it her own. Which brings me to the second part of my talk, which is Betty's unforgettable big telescope story. So Betty is known for the story that I'm about to reveal. She realized that talking about numbers was not going to be very effective unless she had a compelling story to tell with the numbers. And it's been my pleasure really to keep Betty's big telescope story alive. The report on academic women that Betty co-led in 1970 at Berkeley stimulated the academic women's movement at other universities around the country, and it raised the consciousness of many, including Betty. She reflected to statistician Dorothy Guilford, and I quote, "Until I was appointed on the committee, I more or less thought my problems were my personal problems, with the possible exception of no woman being allowed to use the 100-inch Hooker telescope. During the study, I was surprised, as were many other women on this campus, to learn how general many of our problems are, and also how pronounced some of the difficulties are." This reflection was Betty's first mention of her big telescope story. The story was about women not being permitted to use the world's biggest telescopes. Between 1917 and 1949, the world's biggest telescope was the 100-inch Hooker. It was at Mount Wilson Observatory in Southern California. The 100-inch has been called the telescope that revealed the universe. Among the many discoveries made with its use was to show that the universe existed way beyond the Milky Way galaxy and is expanding. With an instrument attached, the telescope allowed the first measurements of the diameters of stars. Then they built a bigger telescope. Between 1949 and 1992, the world's largest telescope was the 200-inch Hale. It was at Palomar Observatory, also in Southern California. Many significant discoveries about the universe were made using the 200-inch. It has been called a symbol of the 20th century's greatest hopes. Among other things, it was used to show that the universe has objects of incredible energy. It also provided evidence that there were stars in distant galaxies. Women weren't allowed to use the 100-inch or the 200-inch. They were not allowed to use the world's biggest telescopes. The way many saw it, this meant that women were being denied the opportunities to make the biggest discoveries about the universe. So what does a prominent observing astronomer do when she isn't allowed to observe through the world's biggest telescopes? Well, she observes under her husband's name, and she becomes the stimulus for the big telescope story, which was Betty's iconic story to promote the status of women in academia. The prominent observer that I'm referring to was astronomer and astrophysicist Eleanor Burbidge, who went by the name Margaret. Her husband was theoretical physicist Geoffrey Burbidge, or Jeff. After Margaret and Jeff were married, she convinced him to turn his attention from physics to astrophysics, and the two became close research collaborators pretty quickly. He liked to joke that he had become an astronomer by marrying one. Together, Margaret and Jeff helped to explain how all things, including human beings, are made of stardust. The seminal paper was described as one of the major papers of the century. Both Margaret and Jeff received many awards in their lifetimes. Today, Margaret in particular is regarded as one of the foremost astronomers in the world and a trailblazer for women. Margaret and Jeff were born, educated, and began their careers in the UK. Jeff was a theorist and therefore could work anywhere, but Margaret was an observer and was therefore always looking for bigger telescopes and clearer skies. So in 1951, Margaret and Jeff moved to the US, where the world's biggest telescopes were located in Southern California. In 1945, Margaret had applied for a Carnegie Institute of Science Fellowship. Her aim was to observe at Mount Wilson Observatory in Southern California, which housed one of the two biggest telescopes in the world. But her application was denied because women were not allowed to observe there. The advertisement, though, hadn't said this. Margaret explained that, and I quote, "Men making the rules somehow developed the idea that the wives of the astronomers would not like the thought of their men working with women during the night." Mount Wilson used the fact that there were no women's restrooms to further rationalize their unwritten rules. Margaret called her rejection letter a watershed moment. She said, and I quote, The letter of denial opened my eyes to a new and somewhat frightening situation, new because I had never before experienced gender-based discrimination. She further explained, and I quote, "A guiding operational principle in my life was activated. If frustrated in one's endeavor by a stone wall or any kind of blockage, one must find a way around, another route toward one's goal." 10 years later, in 1955, she went back and reapplied for the fellowship, but not much had changed in the 10 years between her applications, and her application was again denied. Now, in reaction to the second objection, Jeff decided to apply for the fellowship. He was accepted. On paper, Jeff was the observer, but in reality, he worked in the photographic darkroom. When Margaret died in 2020, an article in Science summed it up like this, and I quote, "Margaret succeeded in using the observatory through subterfuge. She posed as Jeffrey's assistant, whereas the reverse was true." Betty and Margaret knew each other and talked about these matters. Remember, Betty knew a lot about astronomy, even though she was a statistics faculty member. Betty had obtained bachelor's and doctoral degrees in astronomy from the University of California at Berkeley. She had calculated and transmitted the elements and ephemeris of comets. She had researched and modeled the spatial distribution or clustering of properties of galaxies. And she even had an observational bias named after her called the Scott effect. She had many articles in leading astronomy journals. And Betty had spent a summer at Mount Wilson Observatory when she was a doctoral student. So Betty also knew a lot about big telescopes. Mount Wilson had the 100-inch, then the world's largest telescope, and it also had Edwin Hubble, then the world's most famous astronomer. In fact, Betty worked with Hubble, who's pictured here, and other leading men astronomers on stellar statistics projects. She used data that Hubble and other men observers had collected using the 100-inch. Betty wrote, quote, "My degree is in astronomy. As a graduate student, I was very much interested in the distribution of galaxies and the expansion of the universe. Professor Shane, the chairperson of astronomy at Berkeley, arranged that I could spend the summer at Mount Wilson Observatory and do some work under Hubble, the great authority in this area. And I did this. It was a wonderful experience. I measured some galaxies and some stars on photographic plates, and I counted galaxies on slides taken by Hubble and other astronomers." In addition, Betty knew something about women's issues in astronomy from her family. At family gatherings, she heard stories from her Aunt Phoebe. Remember that Phoebe had bachelor's and master's degrees from Vassar College in astronomy, and Phoebe worked as a computer at Mount Wilson Observatory. Phoebe worked on data that men observers had collected using the 60-inch telescope, which was then the world's largest telescope. Phoebe was burning to be an observer at Mount Wilson, but she wasn't allowed because she was a woman. Here, Betty's Aunt Phoebe is pictured at the left at her graduation from Berkeley with a PhD in astronomy. Betty managed to avoid many of the problems that her Aunt Phoebe and her friend Margaret faced. Phoebe and Margaret were observing astronomers. Betty was a statistical astronomer. From the start, Betty focused on measurement work, and she did not aspire to be an observer. Betty had a good experience at Mount Wilson observatories that summer long ago, but she didn't assist Hubble with the observing or even go near the telescopes. She did the kind of human computer work that her Aunt Phoebe had done there many years earlier, but at a higher level because it was connected with her doctoral training. In fact, Betty chose to be a statistical astronomer, and that didn't stop her from developing a great story about observing at the telescopes. And she used it to great advantage during her academic career to promote the status of women. Because Betty was a statistician, it was important to her that her big telescope story be factually accurate. It was also important for her to know that the Margaret story was not an anomaly. That is, Betty wanted to know if all other qualified women were being denied access to the world's biggest telescopes. And so she thoroughly researched the story. Betty went to the International Astronomical Union meeting in the UK. She asked people there about women being allowed to use the big telescopes. Also, the astronomy department at Berkeley had copies of the observing records for the telescopes at Mount Wilson and Mount Palomar. They were posted monthly, and Betty had access to them. She looked at all of the names on the records and when they did observing. This was hard data. Betty learned from the interviews and records that only 3 women had used the 100-inch in all of the 53 years it had been in operation. One of these women was Dorothy Davis. Dorothy was allowed to use the 100-inch during World War II in order to keep the research programs going while the men were away at the military. Even though Dorothy had the consent of the observatory director to use the big telescope, she used it in a man's name. Starting in 1955, Margaret used the 100-inch a number of times in her husband's name. This was even though the administration and everyone else knew she was using it for her own research. Then the famed astronomer Vera Rubin showed that stars and galaxies are in the gravitational grip of mounds of dark matter. She was the first and only woman to use the 100-inch in her own name. But oddly, she reported that she hadn't asked to use it herself. Instead, she was invited to use it. So it turns out that some of the staff members at Mount Wilson were unhappy about the treatment of the women there. And they were especially unhappy that Margaret was not allowed to observe with the big telescopes under her own name. They spoke up, and this had an effect. The observatory's directors invited Vera to use, for one night of observing, any telescope up to the 100-inch. Note that the observatory directors invited Vera, not Margaret. It isn't entirely clear why the directors selected Vera. Betty thought it might have been because Vera was employed at an observatory, and she was also connected with the Carnegie Institute. And it didn't hurt that Vera had an excellent reputation as an observer. The 200-inch telescope had been in operation for 21 years. Betty also learned from the observing records that in all that time, no woman had ever used it. At first, women were forbidden to use it, and later they were effectively unable to use it because they were not able to make a strong enough scientific claim. Even women PhDs working at Mount Wilson Observatory were not able to make such a claim, and that's because none of the women had ever been given the title of astronomer. At the end of the day, Betty couldn't find a simple explanation for why women were disallowed from using the biggest telescopes. Were the roads up the mountains too difficult with their many switchbacks? No, Betty didn't think so. Was there adequate housing for women on the mountains? Yes, Betty's opinion was that there was adequate housing. Were the telescopes too difficult to use? No, there were staff members whose job was to operate the machinery. Were the operators willing to take instructions from a woman observer? Yes, they were. In fact, Margaret told Betty that the observers laughed about this. The operators said that all that they wanted was an astronomer who knew what to do, and that didn't have to be a man. According to Betty, the explanation given by the observatories was that it was tradition. So with all these answers, it's clear that Betty chose a clear story, a story that would be hard to argue was not discrimination. Betty herself said, actually, it's not often that one can point to something as surely as discrimination. Usually we cannot distinguish between the consequences of our own lack of ability and those of an unfair authority. That's a quote from her. Betty understood the power and potential of storytelling. She knew that numbers alone could not persuade. Betty's most iconic story was about the big telescopes, and she used it regularly to promote the status of academic women. She told the big telescope story hundreds, maybe thousands of times. She told the story everywhere, at professional conferences, industry conferences, colleges and universities, high schools, grade schools, etc. Here in this picture, Betty is participating on a panel about the status of women. She's pictured second from the left. Now, many people who know the big telescope story really identify Betty with it. They think women being disallowed from using the big telescopes is what moved Betty to become engaged with the status of academic women in the first place. But as you can tell from my talk today, the big telescope story was something Betty developed as a tool once she started to work on women's issues. Betty's work on the status of women in academia is detailed in my biography of her. I included a few pages in our Leadership and Women in Statistics book about Betty's use of the big telescope story. Here, I'll just read an excerpt. When I was a graduate student at Berkeley, a number of my student colleagues repeated this story to me, and it has remained with me for many, many years. There was something about the concreteness of the object of the telescope, something about women being cut out of being part of the discovery of the universe. It was clear that this was just not right and something needed to be done about it. Change for women in science needed to happen. There needed to be a future world where women could use the biggest telescopes and be a full part of the discovery of the universe. In my chapter, I noted that leaders inspire action through compelling stories. Statisticians should add evidence-based storytelling to their professional toolkits. You can also read more about statistics and storytelling in our recent book, Leadership in Statistics and Data Science, Planning for Inclusive Excellence. There's a whole section in the book on data telling and storytelling. Statisticians should be like Betty. They should tell stories about their numbers. Statistician Brian Millen argues in the new book that data or narrative is a false choice. The two can and must be employed together throughout the advocacy process. And former Significance magazine editor Brian Tarrin reminds us in the new leadership book that numbers do not speak for themselves. It is up to us to tell their stories. So with that, I would be happy to try to answer any questions either now or later at one of my email addresses. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was super, 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 super interesting. And yeah, once again, yeah, it's been great that you wanted to talk to us about all of this. Does anyone we have 12 minutes or maybe let's say 10 minutes for questions. So I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand or type in the Q&A section of the Zoom thingy. We have John Aldrich. Let me allow you to speak, John. Let's see if you can unmute yourself now, John, and speak and ask your question.
Okay. I first became aware of Betty through her work with Neyman and the biography by constant read of Neyman. And I wonder whether her relationship with Neyman helped or hindered her professionally. But that's the question.
Yeah, I think it probably did both. She started out kind of as his protege. She started out, her first position was as his research assistant. He discovered her. She attended one of his classes, and she attended it as an auditing student as opposed to an enrolled student, because I think, if I remember correctly, she had already had the class from a faculty member who she thought was a terrible teacher. And so she wanted to learn the material better. And so she showed up in his class and audited it. And she was, in his words, his best student in the class. And so he had a research assistant position open, and he hired her, and she did excellent work. And then when he formed the statistics program at Berkeley, she was one of 7 people that he recruited to the faculty as an instructor to teach and work in that program, the statistics program, and that was while it was still part of the mathematics department. So certainly on the plus side of things, she was helped by him because, he had a position and he discovered her and all of that stuff. But I think as time went by, he benefited a lot from her because he didn't have a background in astronomy, but he became very interested in it through her. And a lot of their joint work was in astronomy, but she was the one with the background, and so I think he benefited from that, from that relationship more than she did. So I think that it was, it was a mixture of those things, is what I would say.
Okay, what about advancement? Not learning from each other as scholars, but becoming head of department, for example. Did that work for her, a relationship? I'm
sorry, becoming what?
Head of department of statistics.
Oh, I don't know that that was considered a plum job. So I don't, my understanding is that, that wasn't something she aspired to. And like nowadays, maybe some people want to be administrators and that's considered a real positive step. And I don't think in her situation that was the case. I think that job was not coveted by people, but she was big into doing service, and so I think that was probably a bigger part of her doing that job, agreeing to do it, than him placing her. I don't see that he placed her in it, and Berkeley I don't think is the kind of place where she would have been advanced without her own merits.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, John. Any other questions?
Let me add one more thought to that. So I ran across another document after, this was just recently, like in the last 6 months. So it was way after the book was published. And it was someone in the department who, it was a letter describing her impact. And it was glowing. It was written by colleagues in the statistics department well after Naaman had passed away, and they clearly had a lot of respect and admiration for her and her abilities. So I found that to be very interesting, and wish I had it, when I was writing the book. Just glowing about her.
Maybe we have time for one more question in case anyone has one. Yep, I can see something here. So there's a question, I can't tell from who it is, but it says, did Elizabeth Scott ever regret taking so much time for advocating rather than dedicating it to herself and others like friends and family?
There's an obituary that was written about her by F.N. David, where David says she was always overcommitting herself and, basically working extremely long hours because she agreed to do so many things that she should have said no to, basically. Did she regret it? No, my sense is that this was how she liked to live. This was her life. She was passionate for the whole academic menu of activities, and just it was just her whole life. So I don't think she was feeling, shortchanged about life ever. She lived with her mother and took care of her mother when her mother was aging. In fact, her mother outlived her. So she had that aspect of her personal life. Jersey Naaman and she never lived together, but they spent all of their time together, as far as I could tell. There were, the weekend dinners at his house, and, they were certainly together on the campus all the time. So I think that was the life she chose, and I think she loved it, as far as I could tell.
I can see one last question, because this one will be quick, I guess. If you know, Amanda, and it's from Susan Offner. The previous question, by the way, was from Altea. So Susan asks, how many female chair head statistic departments today, in case you know?
I don't have the number, but I have the percentage. The percentage is a little over 20% of the department chairs of statistics or biostatistics are women.
Okay, great. I guess that running out of time. So again, Amanda, thank you so much for this talk, this inspirational talk, as Altea commented as well on a message to me. So yes, thank you so much. It's been really, really inspiring.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining.